The overall objective of today is really just to build on the conversation on the amazing theme of how we look at the lens of climate change through the Indigenous and BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And this is something that as a white male, I often think about in terms of the privileged place that I came from and was born from in my community in Omaha, Nebraska, yet knowing that so many of the communities that are largely impacted, disproportionately impacted by climate, aren't the communities that I grew up in. And so I am extremely privileged to be joined by two recently made amazing friends, Kathy Lee and Reza Jalali, who really were the inspiration for this event. I'm very fortunate to lead the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative, which is a new organization that is seeking to empower youth voices around climate change. We aspire to reach 10 million youth by 2025 with our partners. There's no way that we can do this alone, and being joined by friends and family members from across the globe is really the approach that we're taking. And with that, I really want to just take a moment to thank Kathy Lee, who was the inspiration not only for the Justice for Women lecture series through University of Maine Law School, but really what I consider the thread for this event in introducing me to Reza, as well as envisioning how this important topic could manifest itself through this important week that she really was a visionary behind. So I'd like to first pass the baton over to Reza for an introduction of all the amazing work of the Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center, and then also to Kathy for opening remarks before we turn it over to our moderator for today, Pooja Tilavala, who is from the KCI team and Youth Climate Collaborative. So over to you, Reza, for an introduction.
Thank you, Jonah. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank you and Kathy for including us and give us a chance to raise our voices. So the Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center is really a hub of collaboration. We try to bring communities together and think of us as a bridge between the larger community and the diverse immigrant communities who call Maine home. And as part of our civic engagement and citizenship initiative, we would like to be involved in what is going on in the lives of the BIPOC community members, in particular the youth, and talk about and change a narrative, if you will, that the youth voices need to be heard. So, for example, in this case, we believe that climate change is real, and climate justice is real, and climate change does not know race, class, immigration status, ethnicity, among others, and that there is no plan B, that we only have one planet. And in particular, because Portland, Maine is now home to many people who were displaced because of the climate.
That's my professor.
Did you hear me?
Loud and clear, Reza. Loud and clear.
Thank you. So now, well, I'll be honored to let Kathy tell us more and introduce the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza, and thank you, Jono. It was 10 years ago, it's hard to believe, that the University of Maine School of Law first offered the Justice for Women program, which brings women from all over the world to Maine. In the past, we've brought one woman who spent a full week in Maine. This year, of course, we're like everyone else doing everything by Zoom, but the point of the program is to bring women from other places to Maine to talk about their work and about how their work connects to the issues of justice for women and for girls. And our speakers are women every year who are leading in their communities, whether it's Afghanistan, Liberia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Syria, Mexico, Malaysia, India. And this year, young women from Maine and Alaska who are bringing about change. There's a part of this program, which is the part that I feel is always the most important, which is connecting with communities, with schools, with young people, with organizations like the Immigrant Welcome Center and KCI. This is the lifeblood of this program. It's the opportunity to make these connections so we can have these conversations. Our goal is to showcase the work of women who are making change so we can recognize them, recognize their work, and appreciate them and the work that they're doing. They inspire us, and I'm sure you're all going to be inspired by what you hear today. Our two speakers today, as well as our moderators, are just shining examples of women who are making a difference in their communities. So please participate, ask questions, make comments. It's all really important. And thank you for being here.
Thank you to both Reza and Kathy. And Kathy, extra thanks for being the visionary for bringing us together. One thing I did want to share for those of you that may be interested, and we'll be sure to put this into the chat box before I turn it over to Pooja, is, as Kathy mentioned, the larger Justice for Women lecture series. We have a full lineup of events that are listed here. And Megan from the KCI team, who's joining us today, you'll see her as a participant. We have a registration link to each of these amazing events that Kathy was talking about. There really isn't a day this week that I'm not inspired by in terms of being able to plug into this rich dialogue and connecting communities with the amazing perspectives. Also, just to mention, yesterday's event, we'll be sure to provide that recording for anybody that's interested in attending today, if you'd like to go back and reflect upon that. As Kathy mentioned, what we hope for is that participation. Please feel free during the plenary. You can either unmute your mic. The participation, we're a small enough group that either by raising a virtual hand, or if you do have your camera on, we love to see faces if you're comfortable. You can always just unmute your mic, and Pooja will be doing an excellent job of facilitating as usual. Or you can just simply enter into the chat box any questions that you have. Right around the 20-minute until the top of the hour mark, or pardon me, 10 minutes after the top of the hour mark, we'll break out into some breakout sessions to where both Ruth and Satara have been very kind in allowing us to have a more intimate conversation with the individuals. What I'll do is I will create the two breakout groups when Pooja gives me the okay, and basically assign each participant distributed equally to that breakout group to have just a more intimate conversation. And we do encourage you during those smaller conversations to share perspectives. We're all trying to tackle this gigantic problem, and especially this intersection of how intersections with gender and indigeneity, as well as other diverse elements, really intersect within the climate movement. So I hope to see lots of great takeaway moments that I can jot down and put into practice in my place in life, and just encourage everybody to participate with that at your convenience. And without further ado, I know, Pooja, you are lining up an amazing conversation with both Satara and Ruth. Thank you again, you three in particular, for being willing to share your time and your perspectives. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the visuals just so we have the benefit of being able to see many of the faces and individuals that are joining us for today. So I'll turn it over to you, Pooja, and thank you again for your willingness to moderate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jono, Reza, and Kathy for organizing this event, as well as the rest of the teams involved. So my name is Pooja Tulvawala, and I am KCI's first climate career winner. And that means that they have been funding my time full-time to work on my plan to educate, empower, and activate youth in the climate space. So KCI is really taking action to empower youth like myself to raise voices of other youth like me. And I am based in Bensalem, PA, which is the land of the Lenape Nation. And that's really important, especially given our conversation today on Indigenous communities and BIPOC communities and the impact climate change has had on us. So today, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Ruth Miller first, who will introduce herself, and then we will move on to Satara, who will introduce herself.
Gachlaidu everyone, Ruth Miller, Gustana Shiiji u Shvaik Isan Shiiji, Dani Inakanagashal Kun Kanashtu, Chakayangas Nanash Ite, Takayakak, Shuguya Studa, u Ekogaslan Chugushakaya Kilanda, Shidisnaka Heather Kendall Miller, Shumkta, Lloyd Miller Stukta, u Chikanek Yetel Bagu Diachliet Sete, Chikanek Halikiriki. My name is Ruth Miller. In English, my Dene Athabascan name is Shvaik Isan, and I am a member of the Chukayang tribe of Dene'ina here in Alaska. I'm calling in from Anchorage. Our Dene'ina traditional name for this area is Dekayekak, but my family's from a little bit farther west. Some of you might have heard of Bristol Bay, where a lot of great salmon comes from. Those are my homelands. My matriarchal line comes from a little bit between where this picture is taken and where I am now. I am the climate justice director for a Indigenous nonprofit called Native Movement here that works all across the state towards Indigenous and environmental rights and justice. And we work in close community with, of course, our tribal leaders and our community members, but also with the broader conservation and environmental community, bringing them closer to just transition and decolonial practices. So my work has brought me not only across my state, but gratefully across the world, and particularly engaging with the United Nations and the Global Climate Accords, as well as with a lot of national legislation at the moment towards climate justice policy that's informed with the lens of Indigenous justice and sovereignty. So I suppose I'll share more as we go along, but one thing that I'd really like to speak more about and hear more about with Pooja in particular is I am also a founding member of the Fireweed Collective, which is a group that has a core team of about 10 statewide planning team members that represent a constituency of about 500 youth between the ages of 18 and 35, all across the state of Alaska, working together in communication and collaboration to build power, to establish ourselves as a strong youth political movement, and to skill share and be a resource to one another, to learn together. And so it's one of my the favorite ways that I spend time, and we're 2 years now into that project and only growing. So it's really exciting to see youth all across the country start to collaborate and organize together to build our movements as, present leaders. Chikanik, everyone.
All right, now we'll hand the mic to Satara.
Hi everyone, my name is Satara. I use she, her pronouns, and I was born and raised here in Portland, Maine. That's where I'm reporting from. Portland is settled on the Wabanaki Confederacy's land, so I'd like to acknowledge that. And the Wabanaki Confederacy, I believe, consists of the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac peoples. I believe it's those four. And yeah, I was born and raised in Portland. My dad is here actually residually, as is my mom. Hi guys. And they both came from Iran 25 and 30-ish years ago, respectively. And I was raised in Falmouth, Maine, which is an affluent white suburb outside of Portland, which is definitely very formative for me. And we can get more into that later. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to college and graduated last year. And also in high school, I got the chance to do a high school youth-led radio program, which really was very influential for me and kind of made me realize how much I wanted to work. Originally I thought in journalism, but now I realize it's more like storytelling. And so yeah, that's a little bit about me. I do currently work for Boundless Media, which is a new multicultural and multilingual community-driven media production space. And our focus is really on serving mostly immigrants and refugees and asylee seekers whose voices are often unheard, and they don't necessarily have local media geared towards them. And the community aspect of it is really important because we want to build trust within these communities. This is not supposed to be like a bureaucratic or hierarchical media production agency. We really want people to come from these communities and have people see someone delivering content to them that looks like them and has had similar experiences to them and whatnot. So yeah, that's just a little bit, but we'll obviously get more into it as the conversation goes. But yeah, thanks everyone for having me. I'm super excited.
Great. I'm so excited to unpack the work that you're both doing at the moment and learn more about your lived history. So first, I'm going to ask some questions to set the context for the audience here. Oh, and I forgot to say, so I'm born in India, but raised here in America. And I'm also working right now as the leader of Youth Climate Collaborative. And what we're trying to do is make it easier for youth to get involved and remain involved in environmental and climate work, and to foster meaningful collaboration with youth and other organizations and youth. So let's dive in. For Ruth and Satara, how would you both describe the current climate narratives that you're seeing today and hearing today?
Ruth, I can let you start with that one.
I would describe them as very, very frustrating. Here, living in the Arctic, in the circumpolar north, people often think of Alaska as the last frontier, as this beautiful, expansive, pristine, untouched wilderness. Let me just tell you, the indigenous peoples of these lands have a very, very different history. Our nature is not one that's untouched. Our nature is not one that's foreign to us or that is a last frontier to conquer. Our nature is our spirit. Our nature is our culture, our language, our history. That is one and the same as the life and spirit of these lands and waters. And so approaching our natural world from an indigenous epistemology means resubjectifying our people as part of an ecosystem, as part of the natural world. It means remembering that we have complex and extensive histories with the species of this place, and that our people have spent thousands and thousands of years of learning how to caretake for them best. So similarly, when we consider the predominant narratives of climate change, oftentimes we'll see images of like a polar bear stuck on an ice floe or something like that. These very foreign concepts of, oh, the planet is dying, maybe we're involved, we should do something about it. Instead of, our genealogy is in crisis. Our existence is in crisis. The continuation of our cultures, our languages, our people, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink is in crisis. So bringing ourselves back into the struggle that our climate is facing at our own hands is crucial to remedying any aspect of this climate chaos that we're facing now. And I would say that is for two parts. The first, why that is so crucial is because it reminds us that at what point we lived with solutions. It reminds us that at one point we had traditional life ways based in reciprocity, respect, and fundamental sustainability that were not about, don't go there, don't walk on the land, you'll hurt the plants. They were about, get to know the plants, get to know the land so that you can better be in relationship with it, so that you can learn what it wants from you. and how to best tend to it. And I think that the second really crucial lesson from that is that it reminds us that the climate crisis we are in was in no way inevitable, because we had those alternative worldviews that fell prey to the violence of white supremacy and colonization. We have to remember that those were choices that were made by power holders and decision makers, and therefore we can make different choices now. So if we begin to understand the ideological underpinnings of this crisis, we can begin to remedy it. So investigating the climate narrative is a huge part of the work that we do now, and the work that I do. Some might have heard me say before, but I see myself as a bridge builder, bringing these different stories and these different perspectives together. I have the privilege of being mixed race and white passing. I have the privilege of being well educated and speaking English fluently. And so I get into spaces that, are pretty toxic and harmful to me, but at least I'm let in the room and I can hold the door open for others, right? And so one thing that I wanted to share about in particular that Satara reminded me of is one such media initiative that we took called Always Indigenous Media. That was like my my child, my project over the past few years, but has since had to be set aside a little bit. And this was meant to be a decolonial way to increase access to platforms and spaces for advocacy. I think it's in another room of my house, but we had a styrofoam, or not a styrofoam, because that would be against our principles of sustainability. It was a cardboard microphone. We had taped a little lavalier mic to the back of it, and we began to run a social media based news campaign by and for Indigenous youth in the Indigenous community. And so this arose at a particular event where we felt that the needs of our peoples were not being heard by decision makers. And so we decided to recenter the microphone using humor and community oriented tactics, like gathering and talking. And, we can call them panels, but it was really folks getting together and talking on different issues to share thoughts and to elevate on the ground voices in a way that was accessible and not cost prohibitive. And so we made a ton of these cardboard mics and we sent them out. And so when we think about, current climate change narratives, remembering that people must fundamentally be a part of them, particularly our frontline communities who are living the climate crisis every day, but who are also the caretakers of climate solutions, is a crucial thing to remember.
Thanks, Ruth. Satara, did you want to answer the question? As a reminder, it's how would you describe the current climate narratives you see?
Beautifully said by Ruth, but if I just could add like a couple things, I guess from my perspective as a woman of color, and I'm not sure if I mentioned before, but my parents are Iranian, so I am an Iranian American. For me, I've felt issues with the climate change conversation in terms of who's talking the most and who's going to be affected the most, because and I'm even guilty of this sometimes. Like, it's really easy to be concerned about, oh well, what's going to happen to me when we start experiencing more droughts or the weather keeps warming and whatnot. And that's completely normal because we're human. But it's really important to remember our privilege. Like, for me, just because I'm a woman of color, doesn't mean I don't have privilege. I'm still incredibly privileged, like Ruth said, to be educated and to be white passing in a lot of situations, and among many other things. And so I think it's important to remember that a lot of the consequences of climate change are already and going to continue to impact predominantly Black and Brown people. And so it's really important to bring them into the conversation. And I feel like there's kind of a stereotype a little bit in the climate change movement that like immigrants and refugees and people of color are somehow less interested in it, because it is kind of it seems to be a white-led movement a lot of the time, but I can attest to that, as I'm sure a lot of people here can. Like, that's definitely not the case. I think a lot of it comes down to the privilege of who's able to kind of lead those conversations, and historically that has been white, especially men, but just generally white people. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the biggest thing that I've noticed, and something that I think is really important to tackle, because also, like Ruth said, it's really easy to disconnect ourselves from this problem, also because it's a really upsetting one, and sometimes you just need a break from it, but we need to remember that it affects everyone. And yes, it will affect us, but it will affect other people sooner, potentially. But at the end of the day, it's our one world. There's no planet B, as a lot of people say, which is just true. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd say for all of us here, this means encouraging ourselves and reminding ourselves to question the narratives we're hearing, to question the history that we're receiving, and to really envision a better world for ourselves. Like, if this wasn't our reality, what could be our reality? Like, what could be a much, much better reality for all of us and communities that have been left out from the conversation, and how do we get there together with those communities? Now, a question for you, Ruth. I wanted to ask you, how have you seen climate change affecting Native American communities in Alaska specifically?
Our Alaska Native communities live on the front lines of the climate crisis, with every aspect of our being, with every aspect of our traditional ways of life, with every aspect of our language, because the climate crisis is specifically imperiling the continuation of our subsistence-based communities. Arctic amplification is a phenomena that is accelerating the climate crisis at 4 times the rate in the Arctic and circumpolar north than the rest of the globe. And 80% of the world's biodiversity is guarded and protected by indigenous peoples on indigenous lands. And so when we consider the vulnerability that our communities have to impending climate chaos, we also have to consider why they are even more deeply invested, because of our roots in our lands and our land-based ways of life. And so, you know, to answer your question quite literally, it means that our sea ice is melting and no longer providing our coastal communities protection from winter storms. So they're getting battered and eroding at even greater a rate than before, being forced to relocate. And here in Alaska, we have some of the country's first environmental refugees, villages that have had to leave their ancestral sites where their grandparents, great-great-great-great-great-grandparents are buried because of the climate crisis that was certainly not caused by them. We also see it in increasing food insecurity. We don't have shopping centers in the villages. If villages have a general store, we call them the AC, milk can be $12 a gallon. The food that people eat, the food that people rely on throughout the winter is the food that they gather, hunt, and fish for. And so that means that changing migration patterns, particularly of our caribou herds and our birds, is extremely threatening to the food security of our peoples. But it also means that the lives of those animals is increasingly threatened. I think back to 2 years ago when I had to watch our xika, our salmon, dying of heat stroke in our streams. I was standing at the bank of a river watching hundreds of fish still at the bottom, just unable to move in the sun, because we've had unprecedented temperature changes. We additionally see it as we find increasing rates of toxins and poisons and chemicals in the bodies of our fish and our caribou that are whose bone marrow has turned black with pollution and chemicals. But we also see it with direct proximity to the very development projects that are accelerating the climate crisis in and of themselves. So not only is Alaska the recipient of climate suffering, but it is also the site of the greatest climate devastation through the oil, gas, and mining industries. And so in proximity to our oil fields and open pit mines, we also see extraordinarily high rates of cancers, respiratory illnesses, declines in fertility rates, birth defects, increases in birth defects in our community members. And, you know, the observations are only increasing. So it's, to be truthful, I have to distance myself a little bit from it emotionally to be able to give you a long list of all the ways that we are experiencing climate change, because the list seems never ending and it's all extraordinarily recent. And it's also all extraordinarily preventable. But I don't want anyone here to think that any of that is by accident. Our indigenous peoples live closest with the land and are the last and best defenders and knowledge keepers of that land. So they are intrinsically the first enemies of white supremacist industrialization and development that needs the resources of those lands to create profit. It is so crucial to understand that, and we see it on a human dynamic, even aside from an ecological and biodiversity approach. We see it because around the development sites that are host to what we call man camps, imported labor, mostly from the lower 48, we see an extraordinarily high rate of violence against our indigenous women. Which is the demographic that suffers first and worst from all forms of violence, greater than any other demographic in this country. So it's crucial to understand the ideological underpinnings of why this is happening in a place like Alaska, and why it is so crucial to look towards places like Alaska to move forward in concert with those who are just growing into their allyship with indigenous communities, because we at the moment we're all losing. we are all losing, even those that are turning, you know, extraordinarily high profits off of the rape and destruction of our lands will not have fresh air to breathe shortly, will not have clean water to drink, and it is our people that are closest to these lands that will remind them of that. Well, I'll finish there. I have some other thoughts to share.
No, thank you for being very vulnerable and open with your conversation and sharing all of that with us and inviting us to this conversation. Now, Satara, I did want to ask you on the topic of climate migration in general. Now, through your work, have you been acquainted with climate refugees, and or can you tell us a little bit about the climate refugees in Maine, the population of climate refugees in Maine?
Absolutely. So through my work, which if you weren't here at the beginning, I work for a multilingual media production agency that primarily serves immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Through my work personally, I haven't met many climate refugees, to be honest, but that does not mean that they're not there. Boundless is very new. So, and I was actually doing some research on it recently. And there really is not a ton of data specific to Maine quite yet, which is also true, I think, for a lot of other states, because it's such a new thing, as is a lot of stuff with the climate crisis. So I wasn't really able to get any statistics on exactly how many climate refugees are in Maine, but I did get a lot of really interesting information about in-migrants, so people coming from other states in America because of issues of climate there. So one article I read was actually about a family who was living in Northern California, and they had to evacuate multiple times because of the various fires that were going on, which are a product of our world heating up. So they decided finally to move to Maine because they had this perception that a lot of people have that the North and the Northeast are going to fare better in the future. And from what I understand, Maine does have an abundance of land and water relative to other states, certainly. But like Ruth was just saying, this is going to affect us all. And so it may buy people a little bit of time to come to Maine, but ultimately it's also really, really damaging the communities here. And this probably goes for plenty of other communities where this is happening, but I'll speak specifically to Portland. A lot of people who are able to afford to move somewhere else in the country, that's the big thing, is they can afford to. So when they come to Maine and they buy property here, I'm not sure how many people are here from Maine, but we have a pretty harsh housing crisis right now, especially in Portland. It's just rent keeps going up. Gentrification is happening at a truly, truly alarming rate. Just in the last 5 years, even, it's almost a completely different city. But yeah, this further exacerbates that crisis, and it further damages the Black and brown communities we have here, who are already kind of being pushed out from their communities for breweries and new restaurants. And you know, I love Portland. I've spent basically my whole life here, and it's really disheartening to see that happening here. But there are certainly things we can do to help. I don't want to sound you know, hopeless or anything, because that's certainly not it. But you know, we do kind of have to have those conversations about climate gentrification and climate justice where it meets racial justice, because there are a lot of tie-ins there. And I'm sure Ruth can even speak to this more, but even just the fact that, you know, white supremacy is really a huge part of the climate crisis, and also capitalism, I think, and the need to keep industrializing and keep using what little land we have left. And so obviously those things then tie into who is getting that land and who is kind of being pushed out. So yeah, I'll also stop there for now, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I know yesterday when we were talking, Satara, I really found your work interesting and how you're using storytelling and media to elevate the voices of the Somali community where you are and other underrepresented communities. Now, for both of you, Satara and Ruth, as a young person, what advice do you have for our audience to use storytelling and media to shed light on BIPOC and Indigenous communities experiencing climate change and other social issues? Who wants to take that first? Go ahead.
Okay, I'll do it. So, yeah, so I'll start by saying I never thought I was actually going to work in journalism or storytelling. Like, I really wanted to, but I was like, oh, that's not going to happen. I can't find a job in that. And like, I changed my major and all this stuff because I just didn't think it was doable. But I was in a meeting before this actually, and I remembered this, that like during my time with that high school radio show that I did, I had an idea to do a more, what's the word I'm thinking of? Intersectional, more intersectional episodes, that because it was largely a white led organization and a lot of the students were white. I think I was the only student of color. Yeah. And so I wanted to do stuff about refugees and like interview people who had just come and like get their stories, but there just like wasn't a lot of room for that, which is understandable because it was high school and yeah. But I always kind of like dreamed of that, and then I forgot about it for a few years, and now here we are. So it's pretty crazy how full circle life can be. But my advice to young people is just, and it sounds so corny, but it's true, like, don't listen to people when they tell you that something's not going to work out. Especially when it comes to like career stuff, because where there's a will, there's most certainly a way. Um, if I had listened to people, thank you. If I had listened to people and like really not done this work, like I always imagined I was going to do like office work and like stuff I didn't actually like. But then once I like stopped thinking like that and was like, no, like I want to try at least and see where I can go with this. Turns out you can go pretty far. So yeah, just in general, if you have a dream, don't let people sway you. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Ruth has to say too.
Absolutely. And I'm over here applauding too. Absolutely. I think too, I mean, what is media work except storytelling and relationship building, right? So I think that we really tend to overthink, media strategy. I used to work in communications, and I certainly did. But what grounds us as an Indigenous community is our stories, always our stories. It's returning to time with our elders and teaching our youth to both receive and communicate their stories. And so I think that, I shared a little bit about Always Indigenous Media and literally providing people with a microphone and a platform to share their correspondence and their reflections. But even more than that, I think it's about how you center relationship building and the empowerment of storytellers. I think particularly more towards what it means to remind people that they have stories to tell and that their voices are worth raising. We actually, a little bit of a departure before any of this particular work began with Native movement and Always Indigenous Media. The hardest job, hands down the most difficult job that I have ever had, was not at the UN. It was not at the US Capitol building. It was being a teacher to a class of third graders, all of whom were recently arrived refugees in Rhode Island, where I went to school. I went to school at Brown on occupied Wampanoag and Narragansett lands, and the BRIGHT program, the Brown Refugee Youth Tutoring and Enrichment Program, both had an in-home model and a summer camp. That was meant, to give kind of supplemental support to kids that were really, really left behind in the Rhode Island public school system. It was mostly about giving love too, and having a place for fun, taking kids to the local public pool to go swimming, helping them meet one another, and of course, where needed, have support for learning English in a safe and welcoming way. In my third grade class, we had 11 kids from 9 different countries with 9 different languages spoken. And so much of that work that we did that summer, so much of what I wanted to do in that classroom, wasn't meeting metrics or like following a curriculum. It was about, how to make these kids feel, how to help these kids feel secure within themselves enough to begin to voice their stories, to begin to make space for themselves. Because, empowerment isn't doing the work for someone else. Empowerment is carving the way forward with them and teaching them to do that for themselves as well. And so thinking about media in that light, we worked a lot with storytelling because all those kids had so many stories that they were eager to tell me. So what does that mean to translate those stories into a purpose? To put yourself and your soul into a story, to put your family and community into a story, and then to share that with others for a purpose. That's what media is. That's what media does. And so I think so much of it has to start with that relationship building and building communities of trust, networks of reciprocity and support that can not only, create these environments where folks are eager to share, but can also provide learning and resources and, give folks the technology that they need. Buy kids some little microphones and the silly little ring lights that you can put on your phone, make them their own media producers instead of, asking other people to let them borrow their microphone for a little bit. How do we create deep listening spaces for our communities?
I love
Satara, I
that.
don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yes, please. You saw it. Yeah, Ruth, you put that so beautifully. I think that I even forget this sometimes, but empowerment is actually pretty simple when I think about it. A lot of people, all they need is someone to respect them enough to listen to them and have a real conversation with them. Because I've even just realized doing this work, a lot of people, especially immigrants, people who are new to this country, it's intimidating and they don't know that people are going to take them seriously, and or validate their concerns or their thoughts and whatnot. And the best thing that we can do for people like that, and just for everyone honestly, is just listen to what they have to say. And maybe you won't agree. Certainly I don't always agree with people, but that's what conversation's all about. So yeah, I'm just really glad you brought up that point, because really empowerment is just about giving people a space to be themselves. And then if you can do that with media, that's also super cool.
And media is so fun, right? I was recently learning about eco comedy and using humor to draw in crowds, and really getting youth to, use humor to. It also helps people get over their stage fright and stuff. Just practicing getting out there and trying to be funny and trying to speak publicly, and it's a great engaging way to draw in youth. And anyone of any age, honestly, who doesn't like to laugh, right? So we have some questions from the audience. I apologize if
one really quick thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
I just ran across my house to get the Always Indigenous Media microphone. So this is all about what you were saying, Pooja. It's about humor, because if you ask someone to do an interview, they're like, no, I don't have anything to say. I don't know how to say it. I get stage fright. But if you ask someone to talk into a really stupid glittery mic, which is totally falling apart because I've taken it to 5 countries. And if you are able to, communicate it with our, traditional artwork, this is resonant of our Athabascan beading and such. We sent these out to a number of our community members, and they decorated them in ways that they wanted to. And there's there was a little dinky mic attached onto this. So, talking like this on Instagram is just as legitimate of storytelling, and it reaches potentially hundreds more people than, a formal sit-down interview, which could be really scary would. And it's genuine, it's authentic. And so this was a really wonderful passion project that, man, I'm missing a lot right now. It's still continuing. We just have a little less capacity. So thanks for letting me share that, Pooja. I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course. No, you're totally fine. I love the mic. Actually, at YCC, we were talking about giving mics to members and having them do Instagram takeovers and stuff. But it was hard to find sustainable mics online. They were all foam, like you were saying. So cardboard is the way to go. And I think, yeah, it's a great way to get more youth involved in this. Thanks, Megan, for sharing our link. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ashera, who has 2 questions. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Thank you, you did. I'm just wondering, Satara, you mentioned capitalism, and I'm wondering how the programs that you're doing address the sort of capitalist colonized value of profit over people, which is exactly the opposite of traditional indigenous values. And how can white European Americans like myself be allies to your efforts? What's your wish list from us?
Two great questions. And actually, Ruth, if you have anything to add afterwards, please do. So your first question, yes. So yeah, so Boundless Media is technically an LLC. So we don't really have capacity to like raise money for ourselves or anything like that. But luckily, the founder has funding, and like we've been able to get it up and running without those efforts. But I guess in general, like the most radical way that we are like anti-capitalist is by putting the focus on people. Like it's like you said, like people over profits, that's kind of the big thing. And we're not, especially the founder Abdullahi Ali, I really want to give him credit, even though he's so modest. He is just not at all interested in being famous for this or making this a money-making machine or like even getting credit for it, because ultimately the whole goal is just to put these communities first, because we saw that there was a lack of accessible information, especially during COVID. And we realized like that's just not right and that's not fair. And, you know, rather than just say that's not right and just not fair, you know, he thought, let's do something about it. So, yeah, I guess the big thing would be just like treating people like people and knowing that, you know, I bring a lot of personal values to it because I am the only employee as of now. So I will say like a lot of my personal values about like putting humans first, and just all that stuff. Like I do try to bring that, with also, you know, try not to be biased or anything. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I do also want to get a lot more into content specifically about ties between capitalism and white supremacy and its effects on people of color. But you know, we just started out, so we're starting slow, but that's definitely stuff I want to tackle in the future. And then I don't know, Ruth, actually, if you have anything to add, then we can dive into the second question maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If I, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your question was specifically about, you know, directly undermining capitalism and the ideologies that support capitalism in our work and in media. Okay, so I'm really happy to share. Ignore the first link that I sent. That was just the wrong, I just made that one up. The second link, justtransitionak.org, is the website of the Just Transition Collective, which is a collective of about 8 organizations that we founded 2 years ago. You'll see Native Movement is there, as well as 7 of our other partner organizations. And we work in tandem to think critically about what just transition means. And for those who might not have been exposed to this language before, totally understandable. There's a super helpful zine that we made 2 years ago, but just transition is moving us from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And it breaks down economy to elaborate on all of the aspects that contribute to the management of home, which is what economy means. The zine's available on the website. And so it takes concepts, it takes a systems view of an extractive economy. It's not just about resource extraction. It's not just about capitalism. There are so many complementary parts that uphold an exploitative system. Whereas resources are viewed in a dig, burn, dump cycle, there are things to be taken in mind to put towards a specific purpose. That purpose is the enclosure of wealth and power for the very, very few. And that is achieved through a societal worldview of consumerism and colonialism. And it's enforced by a government that's based in militarism and the prison industrial complex. Work in this view is seen through an exploitative lens. Work is about labor. And so when we transition from that model that includes capitalism as a monetary model, and think more creatively and more imaginatively about regenerative economy and what that can look like, we begin to see massive shifts in every aspect of this management of home. Our resources become based in what is regenerative, what is sustainable, and the purpose is ecological and social well-being. It's achieved through a worldview of caring and sacredness that's fundamentally founded in healing, and it's enforced through a governance that's based in deep democracy, whereas the work is cooperative and not exploitative. But even farther, when we began to bring this model to Alaska 2 years ago, and we began to start talking about what just transition means, this is where this resonates a lot with media work. We had to translate it. This didn't land with us. It didn't feel familiar. These words are long and big in English. And so we took this just transition model and we made it our own. And when we held our first Just Transition Summit of January of 2020, we were speaking of Kotra Ethne, which in the Benti Kanaga language of the Lortenana Dene means we remember. It means remembering forward, because the shift of moving from exploitation and capitalism to regeneration and community is remembering forward. It's remembering something that we've already known, that's based in solutions and reciprocity and community and love that we already have. And it's bringing us through this phase of capitalism and onwards to something more imaginative, something more liberatory.
Beautifully said. To answer the second part of your question, which I believe was what can white Europeans do to help this movement? I think the biggest things, and I know people kind of always say this, but the biggest things are really listening when people of color, Indigenous, Black people are talking about their experiences. Listen with intent to, not with intent to reply, but with intent to understand. And that's like something I also am always working on, just with everyone. And yeah, like really trying to truly empathize with where they're coming from and how different their experience is to yours. And like neither experience is more valid, but just like they're so different. And that's part of being human. The other big stuff I would say is if you have the means, and this also just goes for everyone, because this is more a thing of, I think, financial privilege than like racial privilege. If you have the means, donating to mutual aid funds is really something I think that's really important. Nonprofits and charities, like I love them. I work right next to a nonprofit. Like I plan on working in this field for a long, long time. But, you know, inevitably, just because of the way that they're set up, like there is a lot of bureaucracy, which is just like how it has to go. So like sometimes it's harder to get that money out there quicker and whatnot. And mutual aid funds are great for really getting money to these communities that need help without policing how they use the money. And like really just honoring the fact that they need it for whatever reason. And if we want to help them, it's kind of like not really our business to police what they're doing with it and whatnot. And the last thing I would say is, and I guess these aren't super specific to helping the people of color, but just one last thing that I feel very passionately about is don't forget our unhoused neighbors, because they are still our neighbors and they still live in our cities or our towns or whatever. And especially in terms of talking about climate change, they will face the consequences and do face the consequences without shelter. And that's huge. And so, yeah, just like, and this is something I really grappled with last summer when there was a protest at City Hall for 2 weeks where that was largely organized by unhoused people. And it was really hard, but it was great. I learned about how much more prejudice I had to work through. And, you know, I thought I was like cool and down with like all people, but like I had a lot of inner prejudice where I was like, oh, but well, whatever, you know, you can imagine. But you know, we're all working through stuff. And so like certainly if you have prejudice, like it doesn't make you a bad person necessarily, as long as we're all working on it. Like we grew up in a society that often demonizes people with addiction and unhoused people and whatnot. So yeah, that was a long-winded way to say, you know, don't forget about all the humans in the world. And I think that that not only goes to white people, but also just to all of us.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now we're going to turn to Billy's question. And Billy, feel free to add on to how I ask your question. So you are both leaders in this space and on social issues and speaking out for your communities and for these issues that are close to your heart. Now, what got you to step up and want to take on this leadership role?
Ruth, you should go ahead.
I always, you know, I chuckle a little bit at this question, not because it's a bad question, it's a very good question, but because I never felt that I had a choice. I never felt that there was any other option available to me as an Indigenous young person. What future do I have? What future do my people have? Will I be the last person in my entire lineage to hold the sounds of the Dena'ina language in my mouth? Sounds that I had to fight for because my mom doesn't speak Dena'ina. My grandmother died of epidemic, completely preventable, brought by settlers, as did my great-grandmother. And so what choice do I have but to rise to the moment? Because I want my children and my great-great-grandchildren to be able to live in this beautiful home that I've known. I want them to be able to eat the fresh traditional foods that I love, that nourish my body, that are part of my DNA and part of my spirit. But that might not be an option. I hope for them that they can live without the fear and the anxiety that I've lived with, seeing all of this be threatened. So there was never, you know, I don't see myself as an environmentalist ever. I kind of think, what do you mean environmentalist? I'm Indigenous. Our relationship to land is our survival as a people. And I cannot think of any other way to be in this earth other than speaking these truths and sharing these stories. And that's exhausting. I would have loved to like join an a cappella group in college, but I was busy at protests all the time. But, you know, we wouldn't have half the world's problems if I think just a couple more people thought like that, and began to see our existence as collaborative and our communities as mutually sustaining. If we began to, you know, rise to the moment, to begin to humbly investigate the mistakes that have come before us and the solutions that will come after us, then I think we can root ourselves in compassion. We can root ourselves in love and, you know, all become climate justice warriors or whatever you want to call it. So I don't, you know, I don't see my work as anything particularly special because I really wish everyone did it.
Yeah, thank you. This reminds me of, so at YCC, we have a couple of philosophies that we abide by, and two of them, which I'll briefly mention, are the philosophies of Ubuntu, which is a South African philosophy, and it means we are who we are because of each other. And it really asks us to ask ourselves, how can we be truly happy when we know others are suffering, right? And so just acknowledging that our humanity is tightly bound with that of everybody else's. And that doesn't just mean humans, right? It's like all living things and who we're sharing this planet with. And then the other philosophy is Tikkun Olam. It's actually a Hebrew philosophy. Ruth is nodding. It sounds like she probably knows it. So this one is about world repair and how each of us has a role to play in helping repair our world. So this is the beautiful work that Satara and Ruth and many of us here, or I would say all of us here, are doing in some way or another, and then learning, you know, every day how to be better and better leaders in our community, and taking the time for, you know, self-care is really important. You know, we briefly mentioned how exhausting it can be to work on all of these different issues, especially just hearing, you know, knowing our own privileges and knowing what people who we're working with, or you know, just others in this world are experiencing and going through on a day-to-day basis. It's just very heartbreaking. But it's really important that we're continuing to take time to grow ourselves and to give back however we can. Now, and we're not doing it alone. We have to remember that we have all of us, you know, who are here today, and many, many others, people who've come before us, and people who are here now, and people who will be here after us. So yeah, take it away, Satara. You can answer this question.
Can you remind me what the question was?
Yeah, so Billy,
I just had it.
You are a leader in this space. What made you want to step up and take a leadership role?
Yes, totally. Thank you. So yeah, it's funny, Ruth, that you say that, because I felt that way, but obviously in a very different situation. For me, it was more growing up in a very white suburb. And also part of it, I think, is like part of who I am, but also how I was raised. Thanks, Mom and Dad. I have very, very strong opinions, and I just always have, and I've always been very stubborn. And I used to think that was a bad thing, like especially in high school, when I knew that like people would kind of like resent me for bringing stuff up in class or like calling them on certain things. And like I started to resent it in myself also, and I was like, oh, why am I so aggressive, and like why do I always have to like be right? But then like through the years and through honestly just like protesting and conversations with friends and all kinds of stuff, I realized that there are people who do respect that, and I don't need to necessarily like dim that for other people, and no one else does either, none of you. So, you know, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit, but yeah, basically I knew that I kind of had an obligation. Yeah, I had an obligation in some ways, especially in classrooms where I was literally the only person of color. We could be talking about like slavery, which is not part of my history. I am not Black, but like the way that white students or teachers would talk about it, could be very like upsetting, honestly, to any person of color. And like, I don't know, I felt an obligation, like, okay, I'm the one person who looks different, like I should say something. And so I did. And I guess that's just kind of continued into like my work life and the stuff that I want to do, like why I do storytelling, because like Ruth said, like I wish everyone felt this way, and like I'm really thankful that everyone is here today, and like we are all doing this together, like Pooja said. But yeah, it's almost like so intrinsic that I I can get frustrated that other people don't get it and don't want to get it. But I also have really been trying to learn how to bring people in rather than shutting them out, because especially as a young person, like it's easy to get mad and be like, oh well, that's so problematic, like how could you say that? But at the end of the day, you know, we've already been talking about this, people are constantly growing, and as long as you're coming from a place of genuine interest in growth and learning, that's really what matters. And you know, that's pretty easy to see in people when it's genuine. So I've just been trying to learn to hear other people's perspectives and know that it's possible for people to change their minds, and maybe one day they'll be in the fight with us. You know, it's totally bound to happen eventually. Yeah, I guess that's kind of it. I've never thought of myself as like an activist at all, but I just, yeah, I guess I see myself as a person with strong opinions who wishes or wants to stand up for people who aren't necessarily in the room, I guess.
Yeah, we need more people like you. I want to ask the audience if you can all put in the chat for us, if you can share one thing that gives you hope moving forward. What gives you hope in how we're all fighting the good fight on various issues? And I will also turn it back to Reza and Kathy and Jono for some closing thoughts. And Ruth and Satara, if you want to add any thoughts, you're welcome as well.
I will just say, before turning it over to my colleagues, I'm putting in the chat what gives me hope. Because as a white male that is on Indigenous land that is not mine, my answer is Satara, Ruth, and Pooja that give me hope.
Me too.
Because those are the voices that we need. And I'll be working for one of you three relatively soon. I'm pretty convinced. I know I've told Pooja this, and it would be an honor. So I'll just keep my comments brief, and I just want to say thank you. I have chills from a number of the quotes that all three of you provided, and it is a privilege and an honor to have all of these perspectives brought forth. And not to steal Reza's line, but one of the things that Reza said as we were planning this event, the best outcome of this event is to continue the conversation. And we really see this as a starting point for really some of the deep conversations that I often have to have with my family about where we've come from and the privilege that sometimes is really hard for them to see. And I think, Satara, you brought up a great point. Even coming from a non-Caucasian background is like, even for all of us to just check those biases. So thank you three. I really do mean it sincerely when I say you three give me hope. And I'll turn it over to Reza and Kathy for their concluding remarks.
You're on mute, Reza.
The most common phrase we've been hearing, you're mute. Sorry about that. I just wanted to second what Jono said, that we inherited, my generation at least, we inherited a broken world, and somehow we managed to re-break it, if that was possible. So listening to you three as our future leaders gives me hope that you are going to fix this world. And it's inclusive world. So I'm leaving this conversation feeling very, very hopeful. Thank you, you three.
And I would echo what you both said. It really is what gives me hope, hearing you so articulate and so passionate, and having the opportunity to share what you've learned with other people. Satara, the listen with intent to understand. I mean, that says so much. And I would say to Ruth, to all of you, that it's no coincidence that Ruth's Indigenous name is Whirlwind Woman, which just captures her spirit beautifully. And I've learned from Ruth Chickenick. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. This has really been amazing.
Excellent. We're right on time, but we know this isn't the end of the dialogue. Please do feel free. We'll put in the chat box one more time for any of the events that you may have interest in for the remainder of this week's Justice for Women lecture series. Please feel free to visit the link that is posted or soon to be posted in the chat box. There we go, Jono. Copy and paste. We really welcome all these incredible dialogues as we go forward. So once again, everybody, thank you for joining us and have a great afternoon or evening, depending on the time zone you're in. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.